I want you to pause for a moment, not because something exploded, not because a war began, but because something far more powerful is happening quietly right now. For decades, we believed power meant soldiers, tanks, and flags planted on foreign soil. That world is ending. Today, control no longer comes from occupying a country. It comes from controlling whether that country is allowed to breathe economically. Venezuela is not being invaded. It is being managed. Oil can flow, but only if it serves someone else's interest. Money can move, but only through gates controlled elsewhere. No bombs, no boots, no headlines screaming war. And yet, the pressure is absolute. If you think this story is only about Venezuela, you're missing the point. This is about a new form of power, one that reaches into markets, prices, and ultimately into your daily life. If you want to understand how this system really works, stay with me. Because once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it. And to understand why this model exists at all, we have to step back and ask a deeper question. To understand what's happening, we need to discard an old assumption. We assume sovereignty is permanent, that once a country controls its territory, it controls its destiny. That assumption is no longer true. In the modern world, sovereignty is conditional. It depends on access to markets, to banking systems, to shipping lanes, to insurance, to energy flows. Take away that access, and a nation can still exist on a map, but not in reality. What we are witnessing is a system where participation in the global economy is no longer a right. It is a permission that can be granted, limited, or revoked. And the most powerful lever in that system is energy, not tanks, not missiles. Energy, because energy is revenue. Revenue is survival. And survival shapes behavior faster than ideology ever could. This is why Venezuela matters. Not because of its politics, but because it sits at the intersection of resources, leverage, and control. And to see how we arrived here, we have to go back not to Venezuela's collapse, but to the economic logic that replaced war itself. This model did not appear overnight. It emerged from failure. After decades of military interventions, one lesson became unavoidable. Occupying territory is expensive. Rebuilding nations is unpredictable. And public patience for endless wars has collapsed. So power adapted. Instead of removing governments, the system learned to remove options. Instead of toppling regimes, it began to narrow their choices. Sanctions were the first step, but sanctions alone were blunt and leaky. What came next was more precise. Control the choke points. Banking, insurance, shipping, energy pricing. Invisible systems most people never see until they stop working. This was the evolution from coercion to architecture. A country no longer had to be conquered. It only had to be disconnected. And once disconnected, internal pressure does the rest. Budgets collapse, alliance strain, élite fracture. Venezuela is not the origin of this strategy. It is the proving ground. Because when you control energy, you don't just influence governments. You shape markets, alliances, and the balance of power itself. And the moment this system became visible was when enforcement turned physical. The system stayed abstract until it didn't. Then came a single ship, not a missile strike, not an invasion, a tanker. A vessel quietly moving oil across the ocean, disguised, reflagged, pretending to be something it wasn't. A workaround, a leak in the system. For years, this is how pressure was avoided. Oil moved under false identities. Paper trails were altered. Sanctions became suggestions. But this time, the response was different. The ship was tracked, identified, and seized, not because it fired a weapon, but because it violated the invisible rules of economic permission. What made this moment explosive wasn't the ship itself, it was the message. The vessel claimed protection. It borrowed the identity of a great power, and that protection was ignored. No negotiation, no retreat. no ambiguity. The oil was taken anyway. In that moment, enforcement crossed a line. The system stopped being theoretical because once economic rules are enforced physically, power becomes undeniable. And that single action exposed something far bigger than a tanker. It revealed how control now works and who ultimately decides which rules matter. What looks like enforcement is actually design. The ship wasn't the target. The mechanism was, this system doesn't rely on one law, one sanction, or one seizure. It works because multiple layers move together. Energy production, shipping lanes, insurance contracts, financial clearing, market legitimacy miss one layer, and pressure weakens. Control all of them, and resistance collapses. This is what the purse strings doctrine truly means. A government can still drill oil, but it can't sell it freely. It can't insure it. It can't move it openly. It can't price it independently. Revenue becomes conditional. And when revenue becomes conditional, sovereignty follows. Because states don't survive on ideology. They survive on cash flow. This is why compliance happens without invasion. Budgets shrink. Elite arg. Alliances become liabilities. Eventually, the question inside the regime changes. Not how do we resist, but how do we reconnect? That is the hidden brilliance and danger of this system. It doesn't demand loyalty. It makes defiance unaffordable. And once that logic is in place, escalation no longer needs force. It only needs time. After the seizure, the question wasn't whether pressure would increase. It was how far it would go. And the answer was escalation not through force, but through reach. The focus shifted from the seller to the buyers. Suddenly, the risk wasn't just for the country under pressure. It was for anyone connected to it. Buy the oil and you become the problem. Insure the shipment and you are exposed. Clear the payment and you inherit the risk. This is where economic pressure becomes systemic. Secondary sanctions don't punish behavior. They redefine acceptable behavior. They tell the market neutrality no longer exists. Countries that once operated in gray zones are forced into daylight. Corporations reassess contracts overnight. Banks pull back without being told twice. The effect is immediate and silent. No speeches, no declarations of war, just a rapid shrinking of options. And this is where the second crisis unfolds. Because when pressure expands outward, it doesn't just isolate a target. It fractures entire networks. Alliances built on convenience begin to crack. Protection becomes unreliable. Distance offers no safety. At this point, resistance isn't challenged by power. It is challenged by arithmetic. Here's where this system stops being abstract. Because it doesn't end with governments, it ends with you. You feel it when prices rise quietly, not suddenly. When energy costs creep into groceries, transport, heating, everything, no announcement, no explanation, just pressure. You're told it's inflation, supply chains, market forces. But what you're actually experiencing is policy translated into daily life. When energy becomes a weapon, ordinary people become the terrain. You didn't vote on sanctions. You didn't authorize blockades. And yet your cost of living responds instantly. This is how modern power works. It doesn't ask for consent. It creates outcomes. And the most dangerous part is how invisible it feels. If you've ever wondered why global decisions made oceans away affect your wallet so precisely, this is why. If this kind of analysis helps you see the world more clearly, share it. Not to persuade anyone, but to make the invisible visible. Because once you recognize the system, you stop blaming the symptoms. And that awareness is the first form of resistance. Once this system activates, it never stays local. Pressure radiates outward. When one country is cut off, others adjust. Allies recalculate risk. Rivals test boundaries. Neutral states discover there is no neutral ground left. Energy flows shift. Shipping routes reroute. Prices ripple across continents, and suddenly, what looked like a regional dispute becomes a global signal for rival powers. This is a warning. Protection has limits. Flags don't guarantee safety. Distance doesn't grant immunity. For allies, it creates unease, because the same tools that isolate adversaries can discipline partners. Markets understand this faster than governments. Capital moves before speeches are written. Contracts disappear before policy is explained. This is how influence scales without expansion. No new bases, no new borders. Just leverage applied through systems everyone depends on. And the deeper this model embeds itself, the more it reshapes global behavior. Countries don't align because they agree. They align because alternatives become too costly. At that point, power no longer needs to announce itself. It simply becomes the environment. And when power becomes the environment, resisting it requires something far more difficult than defiance. It requires choice. From here, the system can move in 3 directions. The first is consolidation. Control tightens. Compliance spreads. Markets stabilize under a single set of rules. Energy flows where it is permitted to flow. Prices behave, but only because alternatives disappear. This is the most orderly outcome and the most fragile because it assumes the system remains uncontested. The second path is fragmentation. Rivals build parallel channels. Alternative currencies, shadow shipping, informal insurance, efficiency drops, costs rise. The world splits into overlapping, incompatible systems. This doesn't break power. It dilutes it and makes everything more expensive. Then there's the third scenario, backlash, not sudden, not dramatic, but cumulative. Countries resent conditional sovereignty. Allies question asymmetry. Populations feel pressure without representation, and slowly, legitimacy erodes. History tells us this is where systems face their real test. Not when they expand, but when they overextend. Because power that relies entirely on control must constantly increase that control to survive. And eventually, the cost of maintaining the system exceeds the benefit of enforcing it. Which brings us to the question that matters most. Not whether this system works, but how long it can. So here is the insight that matters. Power today doesn't conquer, it calibrates. It doesn't announce itself with declarations. It embeds itself into systems so essential that opting out feels impossible. This is not just about Venezuela, or oil, or sanctions. It's about a world where sovereignty is measured by access, where permission replaces independence, and where markets quietly do what armies once could not. The danger isn't that this system exists. Every era has its tools. The danger is that most people never see it until it shapes their lives. Once you recognize the architecture, you stop asking who is winning. You start asking who controls the rules. And that question changes everything. If you found this analysis valuable, stay with me. Because in the next video, we're going deeper into how this same model is being applied, far beyond energy, far beyond one region, and why the next pressure point may surprise you. Share this not to convince, but to clarify, because understanding the system is the first step toward navigating it. And in a world governed by invisible power, clarity is not optional. It's survival.